Oh, you know what I did? I missed an animation on one of my slides. So you're going to see my face covered by that was supposed to be a click of a button. And then I was going to say, and I'm the face behind Optimal Finance Daily. And I forgot to put the animation in. So whoops. Okay. But let's get started here. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on this fine Sunday. My name is Diania Merriam. I am the chief economist of the EconoMe Conference. And for those of you who don't know about this event, it's pretty much the TED Talks of the FIRE movement. Our first event was 1 week before the apocalypse started back in March. I mean, if it would have been 1 week later, I would have had to cancel this. So I am so happy that we were able to have it. Um, but if you missed the first event, you can catch all of the videos from the speeches at EconoMe 2020 on YouTube. So just search for EconoMe Conference on YouTube. All the speeches are there for free, and you can check that out. We are going to have our next event August 2021. And I have to tell you guys, I am about halfway through my speaker lineup for EconoMe 2021, and these people are incredible. I had mentioned earlier that JD Roth is helping me on the lineup, and it's just super exciting. So I can't wait to start announcing who the speakers are. Because you're joining this webinar, you're now on my mailing list. So you're going to get all of the announcements for the 2021 speakers. You're going to know when early bird tickets open up to get special pricing. So yeah, and if you're not interested in that, just unsubscribe to the newsletter. That's cool too. I also am the host or the face behind Optimal Finance Daily. So you may recognize my voice from this podcast. Optimal Finance Daily, for those who don't know, is a daily narration style podcast where I read to you from some of the best blogs on personal finance. So I like to say that these bloggers wrote these incredible songs, and I get to perform the covers, which is super fun for me. So if you're interested, I definitely encourage you to subscribe to Optimal Finance Daily and allow me to serenade you with the sweet sounds of personal finance knowledge. So yes, my name is Diana. I know there's an extra I in my name. My mom has joined this webinar to explain to everyone where that came from. No, I'm kidding. But there is a silent I in my name. I was actually thinking of changing the pronunciation to Diania because I thought it sounded like kind of exotic, like a Greek goddess, you know? And then I realized that it sounds way too much like diarrhea. And so that's just not the look that I am going for. So Diana, it is. And thank you again for joining this webinar. So today, what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through some of the criticism I often see about the FIRE movement and my reaction to that criticism. But I want to point out that all of this is just my opinion. And a lot of my rationale here is anecdotal. I'm someone who reads and talks about FIRE every day. I'm someone who curates, other FIRE content creators for the EconoMe Conference. So I've seen a lot and I've been exposed to a lot. And that's really what's where my opinion is coming from. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of data available on the FIRE movement. And actually, one of my goals with the EconoMe Conference is to use profits from the conference to fund a more comprehensive study about the FIRE movement. There is a small survey from TD Ameritrade that I'm going to reference today, but the sample size is really small. So I don't know if it's all that statistically significant, but it is something that we can reference here today in this webinar. I also want to state that there is no governing body for the FIRE movement. There is no rule book, and I'm not going to try to sell you a membership card by the end of this presentation because they just simply don't exist. My hope for you today is that by the end of this presentation, you have a better understanding of how you can personally benefit from some of the concepts discussed within the FIRE movement, and even if you've been turned off by FIRE in the past. You're going to hear a lot about my opinions on FIRE today, but I actually want to start by hearing from you. And I want to see which of these FIRE assumptions resonate with you most. So we're going to open up a poll here, if it works for me. Launch polling. So these are some of the assumptions that I'm going to go over today, and you should be able to. Okay, so it won't let me see what you guys are voting on until I end. You should be able to choose multiple options. So if more than one of these statements resonate with you, please feel free to select multiple options. I believe that that should work. Um, Okay, fantastic. It looks like you guys are voting. And I want to encourage you to be honest here if you hold some of these assumptions, because it's totally understandable if you do. I certainly recognize that there's a grain of truth behind a lot of these assumptions. And your exposure to the FIRE movement was most likely based on people sharing their personal journeys. So, for example, if you read about someone with a high income pursuing FIRE, it's reasonable to assume that that's a requirement for pursuing FIRE. So let's see here. I am going to end polling and I'm going to share the results. And let's see. Okay. It looks like the number one choice, and I kind of expected this, that it requires extreme frugality. That is typically what I hear as the main objection to pursuing FIRE. And it's actually the first thing we're going to jump into today. So that's good to see. And it looks like the second choice here is it's for privileged people who make more than six figures, very related, right? So we're going to dive into both of those topics, and actually all of these statements we're going to take a look at today. So I'm going to stop sharing this, and let's see, I'm going to jump into my next slide here. So I want to start with giving you a little bit of background on why I'm such a FIRE enthusiast. And really the crux of it is because the pursuit of FIRE, which I am not financially independent, I'm 7 years away, but the pursuit alone has really improved my life in almost every way. And where it started for me is that I discovered it about 5 years ago when I stumbled on the Mr. Money Mustache blog. And many of you are probably familiar with Mr. Money Mustache. He's kind of seen as like a leader within the FIRE movement. But at the time, I was financially illiterate and 30 grand in debt. And I like to describe finding FIRE as this like refreshing punch in the face. I think the key difference for me in reading FIRE oriented content versus just general personal finance content is that FIRE really nurtured a deep mindset shift for me. A lot of what I read previously about saving money and getting out of debt had this tone of struggle to it, that it's going to be so hard for me to kind of make ends meet and get out of this debt that I was in. But reading FIRE content put me in this mindset of abundance and creativity and really made my life feel full of possibility. It's kind of obnoxious, I know. Um, so 5 years ago, I ended up getting out of that 30 grand of debt in 11 months. And from there, I started saving about 60% of my income. And that's really when I started to open up some more options in my life. And what that looked like for me is I negotiated a remote work arrangement with my employer, and I moved from New York City to Cincinnati. Now, these days, remote work is kind of normal, right? But at the time, it was a bit of an unconventional ask. And so being out of debt and having kind of this safety net really gave me the courage to ask for that. I also asked for a 2-month sabbatical, unpaid, to go to Spain and walk the Camino, which is a 500-mile trek across Spain. And, that was something that I wouldn't have dreamed to be able to do before I, retired. I didn't think it would be possible to take 2 months off of work. So again, the FIRE movement kind of opened that option for me. Never in a million years would I think that I would buy a house, but that's what I did. I ended up buying a house. I adopted a dog. I was able to fund my passion project, which is the EconoMe Conference. I even took on a side hustle, which would be the Optimal Finance Daily podcast. And I learned that I am resourceful as fuck. I mean, it's really gratifying. Discovering the FIRE movement led to a whole lot of personal development for me. And it really has gone far beyond just money. And that's really the reason why I'm so passionate about it. I will say that as far as this identification that I'm in the FIRE movement, right? I mean, again, there's no membership cards. I think it's more of it really being helpful to identify or have a sense of identity that really guides your behaviors and habits. So, as another example, let's say that you want to complete a marathon, you want to run a marathon. If that's your goal, if you identify as a runner rather than someone who is trying to run, you're more likely to meet that goal because you're going to get up in the morning and run because as a runner, that's just what you do. And the natural consequence of that is completing the marathon. So I wake up as someone who identifies as someone in the FIRE movement, as someone who I prioritize saving and investing my money. That's just what I do. And reaching financial independence is going to be a natural consequence of that habit. So let's dive into some of these assumptions, and I'll share my thoughts here on this. And let's start with the ones that I hear the most and also aligns with what you guys said here in this poll. So it requires extreme frugality. I want to point out here that there are different flavors of FIRE, as if we don't overcomplicate things enough, right? I would say that an average FIRE family, based on all that I've read, probably has expenses of about $40,000 to $50,000 per year, and their FIRE number, the amount of money they need to save to reach financial independence, is going to be around $1 million to $1.25 million, right? Now, there are people who pursue FIRE that we like to call lean FIRE, and they might be spending $20,000 per year, and their FIRE number is going to be closer to $500,000. But I want to point out here that there are people who are pursuing what we call fat FIRE, and they are spending anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000 per year. Those are their expenses. And their FIRE number is probably going to be closer to 2.5 to 5 million. That's the number that they're striving for. Frugality plays no part in this for those people that are pursuing fat FIRE. And if that sounds like you, if that sounds more appealing to you, I'd check out blogs like Physician on FIRE, or Leaf, who runs that blog, also runs the Fat FIRE group on Facebook. That may be like more your FIRE flavor. I also want to point out Jim Wang over at Wallet Hacks. That's a great website to check out. He's been pretty public about having expenses over $100,000 a year. So these people are pursuing what we call fat FIRE because frugality really doesn't play a part in their pursuit of financial independence. And so I want to just, for the people who might be a little confused on the terminology, when I say FIRE number, the amount of money these people are looking to save, this is in reference on how much money you need in your portfolio to consider yourself financially independent. And the rule of thumb here is that you want to save 25% of your yearly expenses. And the premise is that if you only draw down 4% from that each year, your money will last the rest of your life. That's kind of the math behind how we get to, how much I need to save, how do I draw down from that. There are these kind of rules of the 25 times your yearly expenses and the 4% withdrawal rule. Many people assume that I'm eating rice and beans every day, and that's how I save 60% of my income, that I must be severely depriving myself in the pursuit of FIRE. I would argue that if you're severely depriving yourself in pursuing FIRE, I think you're missing the point, because FIRE to me is about pursuing happiness and creating options in your life. So if your life feels very restricted and you're making yourself miserable, I just kind of feel like, why bother? I will admit that I'm pretty frugal, but I personally find it enjoyable. I think frugality can be very fun, and resourcefulness and creativity can be very satisfying. For me, there are many benefits to frugality and minimalism way beyond just saving money, but I don't think it's a requirement to pursuing FIRE. So that being said, I do want to point out that reducing expenses is part of the FIRE formula, but it's not the most important part. Your savings rate is going to matter so much more in your pursuit of FIRE. I think FIRE is really agnostic to your income and your expenses to a certain extent. So your saving rate matters much more than reducing your expenses. If you don't want to be frugal, you need to increase your income, because what you're trying to do here is grow the gap between your expenses and your income and invest that gap. That's really what matters, is your savings rate. And I think the reason why there's this perception that it's about frugality and extreme frugality is because there's a lot more content online about reducing your expenses. And the reason why is because it's often easier to optimize expenses than increasing your income. I think you need to do both, but a lot of times, especially when you're first getting started, you can slash a lot of expenses and see results immediately. So there really are two variables here. There's what you can earn and what you spend. So if you don't adjust one variable to, increase your savings rate, you have to adjust the other one. But ideally, you're going to be adjusting both. And I think what matters the most when pursuing FIRE, or just financial literacy in general, is growing this gap. That is where the focus needs to be. And this visual here, to me, is the root of all financial literacy. This is not unique to the FIRE movement. Even if you don't care about financial independence and early retirement, if you are ever going to retire, you're going to have to save some and invest some money. The only difference between pursuing FIRE and pursuing traditional retirement is going to be the savings rate. So when you think about standard advice, we're told to save 10 to 20% of our income for retirement. People in the FIRE movement are saving upwards of 50% of their income, but it's not required. That really just has to do with speed. Okay. So, I will say that, that all of this stuff has a grain of truth to it. It is easier to pursue FIRE on a high income. That is absolutely true. And this graphic here on income comes from the study that I referenced earlier from TD Ameritrade, showing that of their sample size of about 1,500 people, some were financially independent, some were not. The bulk of the people that they surveyed that were financially independent were in that six-figure club. But, look at the less than 50K crowd. 6% were still able to do it. So it's not impossible. It's just harder. So I think in this group, this less than 50K group, you're really going to have to focus on keeping those expenses low. And I think you would really benefit from that mindset shift and seeing frugality as fun. So on the flip side of the extreme frugality assumption, and we even saw this in our poll, the flip side to that is that people also dismiss FIRE because they think it's for privileged people who make more than six figures. And again, I can see the grain of truth here, because it's easier to pursue FIRE if you have a high income, because you can only decrease your expenses so much. That is a reality. But I want to point out that there are many people in the FIRE movement who reach financial independence on less than six figures. And 3 of them actually spoke at the EconoMe Conference last year. And that is a shameless plug. If you look up the videos from Jackie Cummings-Koski, she did an amazing speech at EconoMe called "The Real Numbers Behind Firing." And she shares how she was able to do this. She started her journey in her late 30s. I believe she was 38. She was a single Black mother making less than six figures. And she did it in about 10 years. By really fully funding those retirement accounts, and focusing on investing. And her expenses were around 40 grand a year. So I would very much encourage you to check out that speech from Jackie. It is incredibly motivating and encouraging to hear her story and how she was able to make it work. And some other EconoMe speakers who were in the same boat, reaching financial independence without making six figures, includes Lynn Frere, another speech that you can look up on the EconoMe Conference YouTube channel, and Jillian Johnsrud, who, by the way, 5 kids, did it with 5 kids. So we will get to the kids' objection soon. So let me say this about privilege, because there's a lot of discussion around privilege right now. And I absolutely acknowledge my own privilege. I 100% am extremely privileged. And I don't think that the FIRE movement attempts to solve the issues around systemic poverty. It just doesn't. At one point, the World Bank reported that half of the world's population was living on less than $2.50 per day. Telling those people to just reduce their expenses and work harder is a bit tone deaf to me. I really don't think that that's the goal here of the FIRE movement. I think the content that has that tone of like, just pick yourself up by your bootstrap and anyone can do this. And, just reduce your expenses and increase your income. What's the problem? That type of content, I think, is really directed at people who can do better, but choose not to. That's a huge difference than people that are really struggling with systemic poverty. I will say that I think that there are many people who see FIRE content and believe that they are far more disadvantaged than they actually are. So I'll give you an example. There was a time that I was living paycheck to paycheck. I thought if only my employer would pay me more, I'd be able to make ends meet. But the reality was, I was living paycheck to paycheck because I was wasting money on dumb shit. I was being irresponsible and I was wasting my privilege. So I really feel like discovering FIRE helped me see how privileged I really am. There are so many people who are struggling, and many of them should not be blamed for their circumstances. Where they are financially, in many cases, it's not their fault. And I think about Lynn Frere, who I believe is on this call today. She did an amazing speech at the EconoMe Conference about the various forms of capital and how you may be wealthier than you realize. And she told her story about being completely wiped out by a brain tumor that she got in her late 20s. She had been saving and investing since she was 12 years old, and it was all gone. She had to learn to walk again. I mean, she really struggled. Her circumstances, that situation was not her fault at all. You can't blame her for being in that financial position, but it was her responsibility to figure it out. And I think that's where the balance is here. We don't want to shame and we don't want to blame, but I think we need to empower people to take charge of what they can do, because I think one of the best things that leads to happiness is agency over your own life. I just cannot subscribe to some of these messages of hopelessness, of it doesn't matter what you do, you're never going to be able to get ahead. I just cannot subscribe to that. So all that being said, if you're listening to this, that means you have access to the internet. You live in a first world country, I hazard to guess, and I'm going to assume that you have access to food and shelter as well. So it's likely, if you're listening to this, that you're pretty privileged too, even if you aren't making a six-figure income. So I have heard it said often that healthcare costs and healthcare concerns, are the number one reason why financially independent people don't retire. I think this also ties into the objection that your money won't last because you could likely have a health scare later in life that's totally going to wipe out your retirement, kind of in the example that we gave of Lynn. The element of truth here is that the math behind early retirement works, but you have to be fairly accurate when it comes to estimating your expenses in retirement. And that to me is the really tricky part. It's really hard to be 100% accurate about your retirement expenses, especially if you're very young and you have a lot of life ahead of you. So if you're in your 40s, for example, you're more likely to have a handle on your expenses because you're more likely to be a bit settled into your day-to-day life. If you're in your 20s, that's not so much the case. I think about Travis Hornsby, who did a speech at the EconoMe Conference. He's from the Student Loan Planner, and he was financially independent at 25 because he was single and he had expenses of like $20,000 a year. So he quit his job and he traveled the world, but then he met his wife and decided he wanted to start a family. So he needed to adjust his FI number and get back to work because, the 20 grand a year kind of went out the window when his life situation changed. When it comes to healthcare, which is often a very scary unknown for people, I think it's really important to understand your options. And the best resource I know out there is FIHealthcare.com, which was created by Lynn Frere. This site is essentially a crowdsourced platform for sharing information about healthcare options. And since the options and rules are always changing, this is a living database that's constantly being updated. So Lynn spent years researching this for her own family, and she's talked to hundreds of early retirees about what they are doing for healthcare. So this resource is fairly comprehensive and it's always changing. So I talked to Lynn before this webinar and I asked her, about this objection around healthcare. And one of her suggestions was to go on to healthcare.gov in incognito mode and just look at your estimated costs now. You're never going to know what it's going to be in the future, right? But look at what that cost estimate is now if you quit today and needed to buy health insurance. Many times it might not be as bad as you anticipate. You read online people saying it's going to be $25,000 a year for me to insure my family. I can't quit working. One thing I wanted to point out is, Jackie Cummings Koski did this, and she is paying $50 per month for her insurance in early retirement, and it's a better plan than what she had when she was working. So, I mean, that just goes to show that, yes, it can be very expensive for people, but there are so many factors that go into that. So, why not be a little curious and see if that's the case for you? If you want to dive into this topic more, one of the best things I've heard was on the F.I.R.E show. Lynn and Jackie both talked about this in more depth on the F.I.R.E show, and it's episode 101. So, I really encourage you guys to check that out if you're worried about healthcare. Another thing to consider when it comes to health insurance costs is to look at the deductibles and out of pocket maximums and then pad your F.I.R.E number for the worst case scenario. Now, again, your costs may change later in your life, but none of us have a crystal ball, right? We've got to do the best we can do with the information that we have today. So take a look at what that worst case scenario could be and use that to help pad your numbers. So the key takeaway here, I think, is that there are resources to help you. There are people that have figured out health insurance in early retirement, and there is a way to figure it out. So I would encourage you to look into it further. So it's not possible when you have kids. I get this one a lot because I have been blessed with no children, but I am surrounded by financially independent people who have children. In fact, from what I can see, most people in the F.I.R.E movement have kids, and I'm actually the exception and not the norm. You don't hear about these people because they are busy raising a family. They're not blogging about the F.I.R.E movement. So that's a lot of the reason why I think you don't hear from them, but they do exist. Kids are often a driving force for many people pursuing F.I. They want to have more time with their family. So it can be very motivating, as you're pursuing financial independence. I think children are an additional expense, just like any other lifestyle choice, but they don't have to be a death sentence to your F.I.R.E dreams. If you are interested in hearing more from people in the F.I.R.E movement with kids, I'd encourage you to check out this blog, Tread Lightly, Retire Early. And there's a post titled Meet the Women of the Financial Independence Movement. She's got a list here in this article of both couples and single parents who blog about pursuing F.I or reaching F.I with a family. So people are doing it. They are figuring this out. I would say that they are the majority of the people pursuing F.I, and you can hear more from them by checking out this list on Tread Lightly, Retire Early. Okay, so it is for lazy young people who don't want to work. So first, I'm going to address this idea that F.I.R.E is for young people. I believe that financial literacy is for everyone. So no matter what age, I don't think it's ever too late to improve your finances. And I was actually really shocked to see that 20% of the audience at the EconoMe Conference was over 50. A great example of this is Becky and Steven over at startedat50.com. And I actually think Becky might be on this webinar, so she can say hi to everyone if she is logged in live. I met them at Camp FI a couple years ago, and they shared an incredible story. I mean, they were pretty much bankrupt at 50 years old, and they still retired in a reasonable amount of time based on what they learned from the FIRE movement. So even if you want to retire at traditional retirement age, especially if you're getting a late start, I think the aggressiveness of a FIRE-oriented lifestyle can help, because saving 10% of your income if you're starting late just probably isn't going to cut it. And even if you're young and you don't want to retire early, the tools and techniques of the FIRE movement can really help you achieve whatever financial goals you might have. So FIRE folks just use these tools to pursue early retirement. You might use them to buy a house or help your kids through college. What we're really talking about here is building wealth. The option to retire is actually a small part of what we're talking about. And I will admit that the FIRE movement probably has a branding problem, right? I think it's so much more than retirement, but because it's in the name, it does lead people to be a bit dismissive of it. I think the focus is much more on financial independence for most people. And in terms of it being for lazy people who don't want to work, from what I can see, the pursuit of FIRE takes hard work and a bit of ambition, which is likely part of your personality if you're on this path. So you're not going to be satisfied to completely check out and not work at all. Many pursue this path for more control on what they work on, for what work they do and when they work. They want flexibility overall rather than just not working. There's a big difference between not wanting to work and not being required to work for your livelihood, which brings me to my next point. When you reach FI, you can do whatever you want. And if you want to keep working your 9 to 5, just go for it. There is no rule that when you reach financial independence that you're supposed to retire. This objection for me boils down to your definition of retirement. I think many people think retirement means laying on a beach all day, and sure, like if you want to just lay around, that's an option, but most of us aren't going to find that satisfying. Even people who retire at a more traditional age, many times they continue to work in some capacity because they need something to do. Reaching financial independence opens up the option to retire early, among many other options. So you no longer need to work for your livelihood, but I think many people who retire early find it difficult to actively avoid doing the things they want to do without making money. So, for example, if I was retired, I'd still want to host the podcast. I love doing that. It's a paid position, and I'm not going to quit doing it just because it pays, though my decision to do it has nothing to do with the monetary benefit. So if you end up making some money in retirement, that's great, and it can help further pad your nest egg against life's unknowns. I see the criticism of FIRE bloggers that because they're making money from their blogs, they're not truly retired and living off their portfolios. So, how can they possibly advise people that the math of early retirement actually works? I've heard the statement, you didn't retire, you just switched careers. And I can see the thought behind that. But I will say this about FIRE bloggers who are perceived to be making money. And it's possible that, they have affiliate links, they're doing things to grow their business, and that requires bringing in an income for their efforts. But I will argue that you have no idea what their costs are. And what looks like work to you may actually just be a hobby that has costs that need to be covered. So, for example, maybe many people probably think I'm making bank on the EconoMe Conference, but I am not making any money off of the EconoMe Conference. I'm actually 40 grand in the red on EconoMe, and this is a passion project for me that I don't intend to make an income from. But it cost me about 60 grand to run this event. I've got to cover those costs somehow. And so I need to charge money to, in sponsorship and ticket sales to be able to cover the cost of this event. So another thing that I hear often is, if you are going to retire early, you shouldn't invest in retirement vehicles because then you won't be able to access that money until, 59 and a half or whatever it is. I will say that retirement vehicles are very important for early retirement and traditional retirement. And when I'm talking about retirement vehicles, I'm talking about traditional IRAs, 401ks, and 403bs. Those are the ones that are pre-tax. So you get to contribute to them pre-tax. You get to grow your investments tax-free, and then you pay taxes on that money when you take the money out. And then I'm also talking about Roth IRAs and Roth 401ks, which you contribute money after tax, the money grows tax free, and then you're able to take the money out tax free because you've already paid tax on that money when you put it in. One thing I want to point out about this is that you will still need to fund your retirement when you ultimately get to that traditional retirement age. So if you retire at 30 or 40, hopefully you reach 65, and that you're able to further funds the rest of your life through those traditional retirement vehicles. Many people, even if they're not pursuing financial independence or early retirement, are a little shy about investing in these vehicles because of the penalties and this perception that you're not able to touch that money until later. So what if you need it sooner, right? What if some emergency happens and you fully empty your emergency fund and you need to get to some money? Isn't it better to have it in an after-tax brokerage? Well, I think there are many strategies to access your money that people don't seem to consider when I'm watching them complain about this on Threads. Your contributions, your direct contributions to your Roth, are accessible with no penalty and no taxes because you've already paid tax on that money. So what you contribute to a Roth, you can in theory take out without any penalty. What you can't take out is the growth, the interest that you've earned on your contributions. So that might make you feel a little bit better. Also, when you start wanting to draw down from your portfolio in early retirement, there's something called a Roth conversion ladder. And this involves you rolling your 401k into a traditional IRA and then slowly converting this to a Roth. When you do this conversion, you're going to pay a tax, and you got to wait 5 years before you can touch it, but you won't pay penalties or additional taxes. This is going to take some planning, right? And this is why this conversation comes up a lot in the FIRE movement, because you've got to be really thoughtful about this plan. The other option is these 72T substantially equal periodic payments, or SEP payments. Now, this is something you've got to set up with a tax professional for equal, and it's equal payments from your traditional IRA. So you roll your 401k into an IRA, and you're going to get equal payments every single year until 59 and a half. You're going to pay tax on this withdrawal each year. And there's some downsides to this, because once you go down this road, you got to keep going till 59 and a half. So even if you don't need that money, or the market's down and you don't want to sell, you're kind of like backing yourself into a corner on this one. But it's an option for avoiding penalties, and it may work for your situation. I would if you want to learn more about how to access your money, check out the Mad Fientist. He talks a lot about this stuff, and he explains it much more eloquently than me. So I definitely check that out. I'm trying to check my time here. Okay, so I'm almost done. I've got about 4 minutes before we get into questions. So it's a cult. Oh, so scary. Okay, so there's definitely this cult-like enthusiasm for FIRE. And I think you see that with a lot of things that are good for you, like a CrossFit or a Peloton. People can have this cult-like enthusiasm for it. I think when people find something really helpful, they tend to shout it from the mountaintops, and we want to share this stuff because it's so beneficial for us. And I think it can also appear as a cult because there's all this additional jargon, right? Like fat fire, lean fire, barista fire, in addition to all of the jargon around personal finance. Like I just went into 401ks and IRAs and saving rates and all of that kind of stuff. I think these kind of designations within FIRE, of fat fire, lean fire, that make it seem like a cult, this to me is an attempt at people trying to communicate their unique approach to personal finance and form an identity around it. So that's kind of like what I said earlier. When you form an identity around a habit, you're more likely to kind of see it through to your goals. I think when you look at what makes something a cult, we just don't fit all of the criteria. So we don't have a charismatic leader. Maybe some people would think that Mr. Money Mustache is like the leader of the F.I.R.E cult, but that's not necessarily true. There really isn't a rule book. There are just endless options. And there isn't even a consensus on the best way to go about pursuing FIRE because of those endless options. So I would also say that like we don't want your money. We want to encourage you to save it for yourself. So, a lot of times cults want to like clean out your bank account for their own purposes, and really that's not what we're about at all. We want to see you guys we want to see everyone be able to find financial freedom for themselves. Okay, so finally, I want to talk about this objection to financial advisors, which can be pretty scary for people who aren't all that interested in do-it-yourself investing. There really does seem to be this like vendetta against financial advisors and planners because they do come with high fees and because actively managed investment portfolios tend to eat away at your nest egg, and they don't perform better than passive low fee in index investing. So there tends to be this kind of like, don't use a planner and planners are horrible and they don't have your best interests in mind. I think we tend to encourage people to do it themselves because it's relatively simple and it saves you a boatload of money. If this appeals to you, I highly recommend the book, The Simple Path to Wealth by J.L. Collins. That is the book that got me super comfortable with investing. And I read a lot about investing before that. That was the book that like helped me feel confident that I can actually do this. But some people are just not interested in managing their own investments. And I don't think that's a barrier to FI. I think that you should learn about some of the basics so that you can kind of be aware if someone is giving you bad advice. But I don't think you necessarily have to manage everything on your own. There are robo advisors that do things like automating your investments, rebalancing to maintain your target allocation, and tax loss harvesting. They can do these for you. And some of them include Betterment, M1 Finance, and Wealthfront. There are also flat fee advisors where they will come up with the plan with you and they will show you how to implement that financial plan yourself. I think the difference here is that you pay a flat fee for advice rather than a management fee where they're taking a percentage of your entire investment portfolio every year. A flat fee advisor is just you pay them once, they help you feel confident about your plan, and then they show you how to implement it, and they can show you how easy it can be. You don't need ongoing management. And then my personal favorite to get around needing a financial advisor is to form relationships within the FIRE community. I would say that I'm not an expert on investing, but I am surrounded by people that are. So there are other community members that can look at your portfolio, that can answer questions. All the time, I ask people that are smarter than me to take a look and double check my numbers. And so I find that very helpful personally. So that's my presentation for you today.